Hey, you're listening to Night Tide. Tonight I'll walk you through one of the most quietly corrosive experiences a person can carry. The feeling that despite everything you've built, everything you've been given or earned, you don't quite belong where you are. That the people around you have something you lack, some fundamental rightness to their presence, and that it's only a matter of time before the gap between what you appear to be and what you actually are becomes visible to everyone else. Write in the comments what time it is for you right now, or how your day went. There are genuinely warm and thoughtful people in those comments, and reading them is one of the real pleasures of this project. If you'd like to support Night Tide, the link is in the description. The experience has a name, imposter syndrome, and the name itself is part of the problem. Calling it a syndrome implies something went wrong in a specific person's psychology, something that can be diagnosed and corrected, a malfunction to be repaired. What gets lost in that framing is the deeper structure underneath the feeling, the way it connects not just to individual psychology, but to how institutions work, how belonging gets assigned, and what happens to a person when the external markers of success and the internal sense of legitimacy become severed from each other entirely. That severance is where the real question lives. Most of what gets said about imposter syndrome addresses the surface. Recognize the pattern, remind yourself of your credentials, count your accomplishments. There's nothing wrong with those suggestions, except that they tend to leave the person roughly where they started, because they address the symptom while the underlying mechanism keeps running. The macro question, the one worth sitting with across the whole of what follows, is this. If the feeling doesn't simply disappear with more achievement, more recognition, more reassurance, then what is actually being asked for? Is the goal to silence it, to survive it, or to develop a different relationship to it entirely? That question doesn't have a tidy answer, but the direction of the answer matters enormously, because the path toward silencing it and the path toward transforming the relationship to it are not the same path, and they lead to very different places. What makes imposter syndrome distinctive, what separates it from ordinary self-doubt or general anxiety, is the specific structure of the disconnect it creates. A person can hold in one hand a clear record of what they've done, the work completed, the standards met, the roles filled, the recognition received, and in the other hand, a genuine, persistent sense that none of this actually settles the question of whether they belong. The evidence doesn't reach the feeling. The achievement lands somewhere, but the interior experience of legitimacy doesn't update. These two things coexist without resolving each other, and that coexistence is precisely what makes the experience so exhausting. Understanding this as a structural feature, not a failure of self-awareness, not a distortion that better information would correct, is the first honest move. Because once the structure is visible, the question shifts. The question stops being, why can't I just accept the evidence? And starts being, what is actually generating the gap, and what does closing it require? Those are harder questions. They take longer to answer. They lead into territory that includes other people's voices, institutional histories, and the very real political question of who gets to define what legitimate membership in any field or community actually looks like. The feeling of being a fraud is not always a private misperception. Sometimes it is registering something real about the environment, something about who the space was designed for, who the implicit standard bearer is, and how much distance exists between that standard bearer and the person standing in the room, wondering if they were supposed to be there. None of this means the feeling is always accurate. Distortion is real. The internal critic can be wrong. The assessment of threat can outrun the evidence. But the automatic move to dismiss the feeling as pure distortion closes off information that deserves examination rather than erasure. The feeling is pointing somewhere. The question is, where? That's the ground this is built on. Not reassurance, and not a set of corrective techniques. A genuine attempt to follow the feeling to its actual source and to think carefully about what it would mean to live not free of uncertainty, but in a different, more honest relationship with it. The claim sounds simple at first. Imposter syndrome is a form of low self-esteem. And if that were true, the fix would be relatively straightforward. Build confidence, accumulate evidence, adjust the self-image until it matches the record. But that framing misses something structural, something that explains why the standard approaches so often leave people feeling roughly unchanged. Imposter syndrome is not a deficit of self-regard. It is a specific kind of severance, a broken connection between two things that most people assume run together automatically: what you have demonstrably done and whether doing it makes you feel like you genuinely belong in the space where you did it. That distinction carries real weight. Self-esteem is a general orientation toward the self, a background sense of worth that operates across contexts. The severance at the center of imposter syndrome is more precise than that. It is domain-specific, role-specific, often triggered by exactly the moments that should, by all external logic, produce the strongest sense of belonging. You receive the offer. You complete the project. You are recognized by people whose judgment you respect. And the feeling that should follow, some settled, interior confirmation that you are where you are supposed to be, does not arrive. Or it arrives briefly and then recedes, leaving the original uncertainty intact. What this means is that the experience is not corrected by adding more of the same external evidence, because the channel through which external evidence typically converts into felt legitimacy is the thing that isn't working. More credentials land in the same unresolved place. More recognition accumulates without closing the gap. The mechanism is the problem, not the quantity of input flowing through it. Understanding the mechanism changes what you're looking at. The severance is not random. It has a logic to it, and that logic connects to how a person learned, in specific relationships, in specific institutional contexts, what it means to be legitimately present somewhere. The internal experience of legitimacy is not a natural given. It is built, over time, through accumulated relational and institutional feedback that tells you, in ways both explicit and oblique, whether someone like you belongs in a given kind of place. When that feedback has been consistent and clear, the channel works. When it has been mixed, conditional, or absent, the channel develops gaps, places where external evidence arrives and simply does not convert. This is why imposter syndrome so often intensifies at moments of genuine success. The promotion, the publication, the entry into a more demanding or prestigious environment, these are precisely the moments when the gap between what is externally confirmed and what is internally settled becomes most visible. The louder the external signal, the more noticeable the interior silence, where the corresponding sense of legitimacy should be. You'd expect the feeling to diminish as the evidence accumulates. What actually happens for many people is the opposite. The word syndrome tends to suggest that what's being described is a malfunction in the individual, something that belongs to the person, that they brought with them into the room. The severance is real, but its origins are not purely interior. It was assembled from something, from relationships in which approval was conditional and calibrated, from institutions that made their own definitions of who counted as legitimate and communicated those definitions in ways both formal and atmospheric, from environments where the standard-bearer, the implicit image of who was supposed to be there, was visible enough that anyone who didn't match it absorbed the gap as a personal fact rather than a structural one. Naming the severance as something built rather than something inherent changes what can be done with it. An inherent malfunction has to be overcome, suppressed, or medicated. Something built can be examined,
taken apart carefully enough to identify which pieces came from where. The internal experience of illegitimacy is not a verdict about reality. It is a learned conclusion assembled from a particular history of feedback. And learned conclusions, when you can see the conditions under which they were formed, lose some of their authority. They remain present, often for a long time, but their claim to be simple truth about who you are and where you belong becomes, at minimum, questionable. The unresolved boundary here is this: knowing that the severance was constructed does not, by itself, reconstruct the channel. Understanding the origin of a wound does not immediately heal it. The recognition that your internal experience of legitimacy was shaped by conditions that may have had very little to do with your actual capacity, that recognition is real and meaningful, and it does real work. But it is the beginning of a process, not the process itself. The gap between what you know about the structure and what you feel in the moment of doubt remains, often for longer than feels fair. What changes is what the doubt is allowed to mean, whether it functions as evidence or whether it gets examined as a signal pointing back towards something that deserves more honest attention than simple reassurance has ever given it. The moment you cross a threshold, a new institution, a new professional tier, a field where the people around you seem to know things you haven't yet learned, something specific happens to how you experience your own knowledge. It isn't simply that you feel nervous. What arrives is a more precise kind of vertigo. The gap between what the domain actually demands and what you currently have becomes suddenly, sharply visible. And that gap doesn't feel like a normal feature of growth. It feels like exposure. That gap is structural. It appears whenever a person enters a context that is genuinely more complex than the one they came from. And, by definition, any meaningful transition involves exactly that kind of context. The demands of a new domain are always, at first, larger than the self-knowledge a person brings to it. That is what makes it a transition rather than a continuation. There is no version of genuine entry into a more demanding space that comes with immediate, settled fluency. The fluency develops inside the space, over time, through accumulated experience that hasn't yet happened.
So the gap itself is not a sign that something went wrong. It is almost definitional to the structure of learning and growth. A person who feels no gap upon entering a genuinely demanding new context either isn't paying close attention or the context isn't actually new enough to challenge them. The gap is information. It tells you that the domain is real and that engagement with it will cost something. The problem is that the gap doesn't stay neutral for long. Somewhere between registering the distance and continuing to work anyway, a particular interpretation tends to take hold. That the gap is evidence not of normal entry, but of fundamental inadequacy. That other people in the same space don't have a comparable gap, or if they do, they're managing it in ways that suggest it means something different for them than it means for you. The transition becomes not a phase of development, but a referendum on whether you were ever supposed to make the transition at all. A graduate student sitting in a seminar full of people who seem to speak the language of the field fluently while she searches for the right vocabulary to frame even a question, that specific feeling of being the last to understand something everyone else seems to have already absorbed is a near-universal feature of intellectual entry points. The seminar is not full of people who arrived already fluent. It is full of people who arrived equally uncertain and learned, over time, to perform the fluency with enough consistency that the uncertainty became less visible. What she is observing is not a map of other people's interior states. It is the surface of their public presentation after months or years of practice. That's the structural principle the entry gap makes visible. The coherence you observe in others at any given threshold is rarely the coherence of someone for whom the threshold was easy. It is usually the coherence of someone further along the same process you are just beginning. The gap you feel is real. The isolation of it, the sense that the gap is yours alone, is almost certainly not. Stress testing this principle honestly means asking whether it holds everywhere. And there are conditions under which it starts to break. The principle holds when the difficulty is genuinely about unfamiliarity, about the real, learnable demands of a new domain being larger than a person's current capacity. It holds when the people who seem fluent are fluent because of accumulated practice, and when that accumulated practice is something the person in question could, in principle, also do. It doesn't hold in the same way when the gap isn't primarily cognitive or skill-based, but social and structural. When a person enters a space where the implicit model of who belongs was built around a particular demographic profile, a particular kind of educational background, a particular set of cultural references, the gap they feel is not just the normal entry gap of unfamiliarity. It contains real information about how the space is organized. The fluency on display in the room was not assembled only through hard work and practice. Some of it was inherited, socially transferred, or assumed as a baseline in ways that were never made explicit, and that were therefore never available to everyone equally. This is where the structural principle begins to fracture at its edges. The entry gap as a universal feature of transition is a real and honest observation. And it is also true that the entry gap is not equally weighted across all people making all transitions. For some people crossing certain thresholds, the gap contains not just, "you haven't learned this yet," but also, "the room was not built with someone like you in mind." And the architecture of the room makes that legible, even when no one says so directly. Those two things can coexist. The first is about the normal difficulty of growth. The second is about the distribution of structural access. What this means is that the interpretation of the entry gap matters enormously. Treating the entire feeling as a cognitive distortion to be corrected loses the part of it that is accurate. And treating the entire feeling as evidence of structural exclusion misses the part of it that is simply the texture of genuine learning. The transition principle that follows from this is uncomfortable. The same feeling, the gap, the vertigo, the sense of being less fluent than the room, carries different amounts of signal depending on the specific structure of the space being entered. Learning to distinguish between those two components of the feeling is not a simple task. It requires knowing something about the history of the institution, about who was assumed to be its default occupant, and about whether the fluency on display in the room was assembled from conditions that were ever equally available to you. That knowledge doesn't make the gap disappear, but it changes whether the gap is something to work through or something that is also, in part, something to name. Whose voice is it, actually? That question sounds almost too simple to take seriously, but it turns out to be one of the most structurally important questions you can ask about the experience of imposter syndrome. The internal critic, that reliable, precise, often devastating voice that tells you your presence here is provisional, your competence overstated, your admission into this room a mistake waiting to be discovered, did not generate itself. It was assembled. And it was assembled from specific material, from relationships, from institutional atmospheres, from the accumulated feedback of environments that had their own ideas about who counted as legitimate and who was still under review.
The mechanism of the internal critic is not random noise. It has a grammar, a consistent set of triggers, a recognizable logic, a particular way of selecting which moments to target with the most force. It tends to activate at precisely the moments of highest visibility, when you are about to speak in a room full of people who seem more certain than you, when work you've made is about to be evaluated, when someone whose opinion you respect pays you a specific kind of attention. The consistency of that pattern is information. Something with that degree of internal coherence was built from coherent source material. It learned when to speak up from somewhere. The origin matters because it changes the authority of the voice. Think about how a child absorbs what it means to earn a place in a room. Explicit instruction is only part of it. The rest comes through tone, through the gap between what effort produces and what approval follows, through watching which achievements get celebrated and which get treated as merely expected, through the atmospherics of institutions that communicate their own definitions of the legitimate student, the legitimate professional, the legitimate member of this particular intellectual community. None of this is neutral. A child who grows up in a relationship where approval was reliably conditional, where love or regard arrived in response to performance and withdrew in response to failure, learns a very specific lesson about what presence requires. Presence requires justification. Entry requires proof. And proof is never quite final, because the next evaluation is always coming. That lesson gets carried forward. It doesn't dissolve when the relationship ends or when the original environment is left behind. It gets installed as an operating assumption about how spaces work, about what belonging requires, about what happens when your adequacy is tested and found uncertain. The internal critic in imposter syndrome is often this lesson, still running in a context it was never designed for, translating the logic of an early relationship into a professional or intellectual environment where the terms are completely different. This is the point where identifying the origin becomes practically meaningful, not just intellectually interesting. When you can hear a voice with that kind of consistency and recognize it as a voice, a specific set of learned conclusions, formed under specific conditions in response to specific people and institutions, its claim to be stating simple fact about your current situation starts to loosen. The voice says, "You will be found out." And what becomes visible if you look carefully is that this conclusion was formed in an environment where being found out was a real and present risk, where the evaluation was ongoing and the outcome was always uncertain. That environment may have nothing to do with where you are now. The voice is still reporting from there. Understanding this doesn't silence the critic. That would be too simple and too fast. But it does change the relationship. A voice mistaken for the neutral observation of reality has one kind of authority. A voice recognized as a learned system, assembled under particular conditions, speaking from a particular relational history, that voice has a different standing. You can ask it where it learned what it knows. You can check whether the conditions that trained it are actually present in the current situation. You can, over time and with some effort, begin to cross-examine it rather than simply receive its verdicts as settled fact. There is a human cost to not doing this, and the cost is specific. When the learned voice is treated as objective reporting, its conclusions become the ground on which every piece of external feedback lands. A positive evaluation arrives, and the voice tells you the evaluator was wrong, or generous, or didn't see deeply enough. A negative response arrives, and the voice tells you it confirms everything. The asymmetry is total. Disconfirming evidence is explained away. Confirming evidence is absorbed as proof. The system becomes unfalsifiable, and an unfalsifiable internal system is one you can't learn anything from, because its conclusions are determined in advance by the structure of the system, rather than by the actual content of what is happening in the room. That asymmetry
is where so much of the real damage accumulates. Not in any single moment of doubt, but in the long-term effect of a system that processes all evidence in the same direction. Genuine feedback, both the kind that identifies real gaps and the kind that recognizes real strength, cannot do its work when it passes through a filter trained to sort everything into a single conclusion. Growth requires a feedback loop that can actually close, which means it requires a relationship to your own uncertainty that can update when the evidence shifts. The partial resolution available here is not the elimination of the voice. That's neither achievable nor, in all honesty, desirable. There are things the internal critic notices that deserve attention. The resolution is the shift from obedience to examination. A learned voice, once recognized as such, becomes something you can hold at a slight distance. Not dismissively, not by refusing to hear what it says, but with enough clarity about its origins to ask whether what it's reporting actually applies. Whose standards is it applying? Whose definition of belonging is it working from? Whose image of the legitimate occupant of this space was it trained on? And does that image have any real authority here, in this room, at this moment? Those questions don't produce instant relief, but they do something more durable. They interrupt the automatic conversion of doubt into verdict, and that interruption, even when it's imperfect, even when the voice reasserts itself almost immediately, creates a small but structurally significant gap between feeling the doubt and being ruled by it. That gap is where something other than the learned conclusion has room to operate. There is a paradox sitting at the center of expertise that almost never gets named directly, and it goes something like this. The more genuinely you learn a field, the worse you feel about how much you know.
That sounds like it should be wrong. The ordinary assumption is that competence and confidence move together, that as one increases, the other follows naturally. And at some point of sufficient mastery, the internal noise quiets down and you simply know what you know. The paradox is that this is not what actually happens. And the reason it doesn't happen is structural, which means reassurance won't touch it. And telling yourself to remember how far you've come won't resolve it, because the feeling isn't a misreading of your progress. It's a consequence of the progress itself. Here's the mechanism. A person at the beginning of learning a domain has a particular relationship to its edges. The edges are invisible. The domain appears, more or less, as a coherent body of settled knowledge, things that are known, positions that are established, questions that have answers. Early competence is often accompanied by a kind of relative ease with this picture, because the gaps in it haven't yet become visible. What you don't know enough to see. The questions you haven't yet learned to ask aren't producing any anxiety, because you haven't encountered the conceptual terrain where they live. Then something changes. The learning deepens, and with it comes the capacity to see the field more accurately, which means seeing not just what it contains, but where it breaks down, where the apparent consensus is actually a working agreement holding open questions at bay, where the confident-sounding claims in the literature are contested in ways that the introductory version of the field doesn't mention. The deeper you go, the more clearly the edges of the known become visible. The open questions multiply. The distance between what is currently understood and what is still genuinely uncertain grows larger, not smaller, in your perception. This is not pessimism. It is clarity. The person who sees all of this is seeing more accurately than the person who saw only settled coherence. What the subjective experience of seeing more accurately can feel, and this is the crux of the paradox, like knowing less. Because what has actually changed is the ratio. The amount of visible uncertainty has grown relative to the amount of settled ground. You are standing on more territory and can also see, far more clearly, how much territory remains. the space of not knowing has expanded in your field of view, even as your actual competence has grown. The word for this in epistemology, the study of knowledge, is the Dunning-Kruger curve's often missed second phase. The first phase gets all the attention, the early overconfidence of the novice who doesn't know what they don't know. But the valley that follows, the steep drop in confidence that accompanies genuine growing competence, the moment when you know enough to understand the scale of what you're working with, that valley is where imposter syndrome often lives most intensely, and it is populated by people who are doing exactly what they should be doing. Getting better, seeing more clearly, becoming more genuinely capable of engaging with the real complexity of the domain. That's the explicit form of the paradox. The feeling of not knowing enough is often sharpest not at the point of genuine inadequacy, but at the point of genuine advance. The people most likely to carry that feeling with the most weight are the people who have gone far enough into a domain to see its actual structure. The person who has never gone that far doesn't feel the particular anxiety of standing at a real edge, because they haven't reached one yet.
So what does resolution look like? The obvious move is to say, recognize this dynamic, understand that the growing doubt is evidence of growing competence, and let that understanding dissolve the anxiety. And there is something real in that move. It is not useless to understand the structure of what you're experiencing. Naming the paradox changes the relationship to it, at least partially. It becomes something you can recognize rather than something that only happens to you. The reason the resolution is incomplete is located in the fact that understanding is not the same as experiencing. You can hold the full intellectual picture. Yes, I know that seeing the edges of the field clearly is a sign of deeper learning. Yes, I understand the mechanism. And still feel, in the moment of evaluation, in the room full of people whose uncertainty is less visible than your own, the full weight of not knowing as a threat, rather than as a feature of serious engagement. The cognitive map and the felt experience exist at different speeds. The map can shift in the time it takes to read a sentence. The experience is slower, more embodied, trained into something closer to reflex. The gap between knowing the map and living inside it is where the paradox becomes genuinely hard to resolve. Because the resolution requires not just understanding the dynamic, but inhabiting a different relationship to uncertainty over time. Developing something like comfort, or at minimum tolerance, for the ongoing experience of not knowing at the edge of a domain you are genuinely trying to work within. That is not a cognitive achievement. It is closer to a practice, and practices take longer than understanding. What this means for you, concretely, is that the feeling of deepening doubt in a field you have been working hard at is not evidence that the work has been going wrong. The doubt and the genuine development are often running on the same track, produced by the same process of engagement. The person in the room who seems most comfortable, most settled in their certainty, may be further from the real edges of the field than you are, because the edges are uncomfortable, and only proximity to them generates that specific form of disquiet. Certainty at the surface and uncertainty at the depth are both features of expertise, distributed differently depending on how far in a person has gone and how honestly they are looking at what they find there. The consequence of naming this paradox and still finding it unresolvable is not despair. It is a specific kind of reorientation. If growing competence cannot be relied upon to quiet the feeling of not knowing enough, then the goal of reaching a point where the feeling disappears, a point of sufficient mastery where the internal noise simply stops, is a goal organized around a false picture
of how expertise works. The noise doesn't stop. The question is what you do with a practice that keeps producing it. The common assumption about imposter syndrome is that the feeling persists because people haven't yet absorbed the evidence of their own competence. That with enough accumulated proof, enough external confirmation, enough credentials stacked in the right order, the internal gap would eventually close. The remedy follows naturally from this assumption. Collect the evidence, remind yourself of what you've built, seek reassurance from people whose opinion you respect, and let their recognition do the corrective work your own perception cannot do alone.
The problem with this is not that the advice is poorly intentioned. It's that it misidentifies where the gap actually lives. External validation addresses the visible surface of the problem, the absence of acknowledged achievement, the sense of being unseen. But imposter syndrome doesn't primarily arise from being unseen. It arises from a severed connection between what is externally visible and what feels internally true. The achievement is already there. The credential already exists. The recognition has already been offered. And still the feeling persists, unmoved, sometimes even intensified by the very attention it was supposed to be resolved by. Someone tells you your work is good, and the critic inside says they didn't look closely enough. Someone gives you the position, and the internal voice says they would have chosen differently if they'd known more. The validation lands in a system that has already decided in advance how to process it. This is the structural failure of external remedies. They are delivered by exactly the authority the syndrome already distrusts. Think about the specific logic of the experience. The fear is that others will eventually discover you don't belong. That fear is organized around an external judgment, around what people in the room would conclude if they saw clearly. So when those same people offer reassurance, the reassurance comes from the very source the fear is anticipating a verdict from. It doesn't resolve the doubt. It passes through the same filter that generated it. Reassurance in this architecture is almost definitionally inconclusive. There's a specific illustration of this dynamic that appears often enough to be treated as a general pattern rather than an individual case. Someone receives strong external recognition, a competitive fellowship, a promotion arrived at through genuine selection, a published work with a clear evaluative record behind it, and instead of settling the question of legitimacy, the recognition intensifies the anxiety. Because now the stakes of being discovered are higher. The gap between what others believe and what the person fears is true has grown, not narrowed. More people are invested in a picture that the internal critic insists is incomplete. The external validation hasn't closed anything. It has raised the height of a potential fall. The mechanism underneath this is worth pressing on. When the relationship between self and role is already damaged, when belonging to a space feels conditional, temporary, subject to revocation, external confirmation doesn't repair the relationship. It adds information to a system that is not processing information about competence. It's processing information about a different question entirely. Whether the self is fundamentally the kind of entity that belongs here. Credentials don't answer that question. Praise doesn't answer it. Another person's certainty about your value cannot reach the layer where the question is actually running.
What this means is that the standard remedy is not wrong in its ingredients so much as wrong in its theory of where the problem is located. Listing achievements is fine. Receiving honest feedback is genuinely useful. None of that is the error. The error is believing that doing these things at sufficient intensity will eventually fill a gap that is located somewhere those tools don't reach. In the structure of how the self relates to the role, in the learned operating assumptions about what presence requires and what proof can finally settle. The complication is that recognizing this doesn't automatically produce a better remedy. Understanding that external validation is structurally insufficient does not by itself generate the internal shift that would make the feeling responsive to evidence. If the problem is in the relationship between self and role, in the architecture of how legitimacy is experienced, then working on that architecture requires a different kind of attention than simply supplying more inputs to the existing system. It requires getting at the level of the system itself, the conditions under which the doubt activates, the logic it is running, the specific questions it is organized around, and where those questions came from. That work is slower. It is less satisfying to describe because it doesn't have the clean shape of a remedy. No list of things to do, no milestone at which it can be declared complete. What it looks like in practice is closer to a sustained act of examination, taking the internal critic seriously enough to interrogate it, rather than either obeying it or dismissing it. Asking what evidence would actually be sufficient, and then asking why that threshold is set where it is. Noticing the conditions under which the feeling intensifies, and treating those conditions as data about the system, rather than as confirmation of its conclusions. The transition principle that emerges from this is not motivational. It's structural. If you want to work on imposter syndrome at the level where it actually lives, the question is not how to accumulate more proof of legitimacy. The question is what kind of entity you believe legitimacy belongs to, and whether the definition you're working with is one that you constructed or one that was handed to you by environments that had their own reasons for keeping it unstable. That question has an answer, but the answer is not the same for everyone, and it is not arrived at by collecting credentials. It is arrived at by examining the architecture underneath the doubt, which means starting not with the symptom of insufficient external validation, but with the mechanism that makes external validation insufficient in the first place. Imposter syndrome is not distributed evenly. That much can be stated as a starting claim, and it matters more than it might initially seem, because the way a feeling is distributed tells you something about what is actually generating it. The broad picture is this: the syndrome appears across populations, across professions, across levels of achievement and institutional standing. In that sense, it seems universal, a feature of the human relationship to self-assessment under pressure. And there is something true in that. The experience of doubting one's legitimacy is not confined to any one group. Whenever real stakes meet real self-scrutiny, some version of the doubt can surface.
But universality of distribution and evenness of distribution are different claims, and conflating them is where the analysis tends to go wrong. The feeling is not equally heavy, equally chronic, or equally resistant to resolution across all the people who experience it. It concentrates. It gathers with particular density around a specific kind of situation. The person who has entered a space that was not, in its design and its history and its unstated operating assumptions, built with them in mind. The first-generation university student in an institution whose culture was constructed by and for people whose parents also attended. The woman in a technical field whose presence is still treated by 1,000 small signals as requiring more justification than a male colleague's identical presence. The person whose accent, background, or social origin falls outside the implicit norm of the professional environment they've trained hard to enter. For these people, the feeling of not quite belonging carries a different weight. Not because they are more psychologically fragile, but because the environment is providing them with more ambiguous signals about whether they do belong. A colleague gets the benefit of the doubt as a default. They don't.
An error by someone who fits the environment's template is absorbed as ordinary. The same error by someone who doesn't fit is subtly marked as potentially diagnostic. These are not paranoid readings. They are often accurate perceptions of real asymmetries in how judgment is applied. This is the gap between the scale of the claim and the specific case. At scale, imposter syndrome is a phenomenon of self-doubt under conditions of achievement. In the specific case, for someone entering a space not designed with them in mind, the doubt is frequently doing something more precise. It is registering real information about how the environment is actually organized. Treating this as pure cognitive distortion, as a private misreading of neutral evidence, erases the information the feeling is carrying. When someone in this position says, "I feel like I don't fully belong here," the psychologically tidy response is to say the feeling is the problem, that the work is to correct the internal reading. And sometimes the reading is distorted. Human beings do amplify uncertainty into threat, do read ambiguity as hostile, do weight negative signals disproportionately. Cognitive distortion is real, but it is not the whole story. And when the whole story includes an environment that has systematically signaled, through its history, its demographics, its informal culture, its patterns of recognition and reward, that certain kinds of people are guests rather than permanent residents, then the internal doubt is picking up a real frequency. It is not generating noise, it is receiving a transmission. A person who has navigated a graduate program where the informal networks, the cultural references, the shared assumptions about what serious intellectual life looks like were all calibrated to a demographic that doesn't include them. That person has genuine experiential data to draw on when they feel uncertain about belonging. The data may be incomplete, may be weighted by anxiety, may miss important counter-evidence, but it is not simply wrong. Calling it distortion without examining what it is responding to is itself a kind of distortion in the other direction.
What this means systemically is significant. If a meaningful portion of what gets classified as imposter syndrome in certain populations is actually accurate social perception, a reading of real asymmetries, real unstated hierarchies, real costs attached to being outside the norm, then treating it exclusively as a psychological problem to be corrected leaves the structural conditions intact. The person is advised to think differently about themselves, while the environment that generated the doubt continues operating as it always has. The remedy is targeted at the receiver, not at the signal. There is a harder version of this point. Environments that produce this kind of concentrated, accurate self-doubt have a particular incentive not to name what they're doing. When the people most affected conclude that the problem is internal, their perception, their insufficient confidence, their failure to absorb the evidence of their own competence, the structure is effectively self-sealing. It continues to operate without being examined because the people most sensitive to its operation have been redirected toward examining themselves instead. The doubt becomes a mechanism for absorbing structural friction without converting it into structural pressure. The open question that follows from all of this is one that doesn't resolve neatly. If some of what feels like imposter syndrome is accurate perception, how does the person experiencing it distinguish between the part that is distortion and the part that is real signal? There is no clean instrument for that. The feelings themselves don't announce their origins. Anxiety, shaped by a genuinely unwelcoming environment, and anxiety shaped by learned self-doubt, can feel identical from the inside, can produce the same voice with the same content and the same authority. Working out which is which
requires looking not just inward at the doubt, but outward at the conditions that are producing it, and being willing to hold both possibilities at once without defaulting to the more comfortable reading. That discomfort is not incidental. It is the actual territory. And the question of whether a given environment is producing accurate signals or whether the doubt has outrun the evidence, that question is worth sitting with, because the answer shapes everything about what kind of work is actually needed. There is a move that seems logical when the feeling of fraud becomes unbearable. You decide to perform your way out of it. You present the confidence you don't have. Carry yourself as someone who belongs without question. Let nothing in your manner signal the doubt running underneath. The performance feels like a solution because it addresses the most immediate fear, that the doubt will be visible, that the gap between what others believe about you and what you believe about yourself will become legible to the room. The trap is in what happens next. Performing confidence to escape the anxiety of fraud does not close the anxiety. It relocates it. Once the performance is in place, a second question appears underneath the first one. Not just whether you belong, but whether you have been concealing the fact that you know you don't. The original fear was discovery. The performance adds a layer. Now what might be discovered is not just incompetence, but the deliberate construction of a false front. The stakes have risen. The concealment is now its own thing to be concealed.
This is the compounding structure of the trap. The person who walks into a room quietly doubting their legitimacy is in one kind of difficulty. The person who walks in performing certainty they don't feel is in a related but structurally different difficulty, one where any crack in the presentation threatens to expose not just the doubt, but the act of hiding it. And the sustained vigilance this requires is exhausting in a way that isn't always named. It consumes attention that would otherwise be available for the actual work. The mind is running two operations, the work itself and the continuous management of how the work is being received, how the self is being read, where the mask might be showing its edges. What makes this particularly corrosive is that the performance, over time, becomes its own evidence. If you spend long enough performing confidence you don't feel, the gap between the performance and the interior experience widens rather than closes. The outer presentation and the inner state diverge further, and the original question, whether you belong, now carries a second layer of complication, because even if you did belong, you have been performing something other than what is actually present in you. The fraud was supposed to be about competence. It has become something more uncomfortable, a fraud about what kind of person you actually are in this space. The conventional prescription here is usually framed as authenticity. Drop the performance. Be honest about the uncertainty. That framing is not wrong as a direction. The difficulty is in the structure of what dropping the performance costs. In environments where doubt is read as incompetence, where provisional membership is waiting for any reason to become confirmed exclusion, transparency about uncertainty carries a real price. The advice to just be honest about not knowing is much cheaper to give than to follow. The performance wasn't irrational. It was a response to a genuine set of conditions. Pointing at it as the error without accounting for why it started misses the mechanism. The more precise thing to say is that the performance solves the wrong problem. It addresses the visibility of the doubt while leaving the doubt itself entirely intact. And because the fear that drives it, discovery, exposure, revocation, is organized around external judgment, no amount of successfully passing as certain can quiet it. The performance succeeds, and the internal system notes that success as temporary, provisional, subject to the next test. Another conversation, another meeting, another piece of work, and the question will be asked again. The performance has to be sustained indefinitely because the thing it is protecting against never actually arrives, and its non-arrival provides no evidence that it won't. There is something worth looking at carefully in why this loop persists. It accumulates in smaller costs. The energy spent monitoring presentation, the attenuation of genuine engagement with work because part of attention is always elsewhere, the gradual withdrawal from situations where the gap between the performance and the interior state might be exposed. Ambition starts to shrink to a more manageable circumference. The person stops going after the opportunities where the performance might crack and starts choosing for safety instead. The fraud defense begins to organize actual decisions. The limit of explanation at this point is important to name honestly. Understanding that this is a trap does not automatically spring it. Knowing the structure of the compounding anxiety, original doubt plus concealment of doubt, does not make the performance feel optional if the environment is genuinely one where visible uncertainty invites exclusion. The insight is real, and it is insufficient by itself. What it does is change the nature of the question being asked. The question stops being how to hide the doubt more effectively, or how to generate enough genuine confidence to make the performance unnecessary. It becomes something different. What would it mean to engage with the work, with the room, with the relationship, from where you actually are? And what would actually need to be different, internally or structurally, for that to be possible? That question is uncomfortable because it doesn't resolve cleanly into a set of moves. It requires looking at both sides of the equation, the internal architecture of the doubt and the real conditions of the environment that made the performance feel necessary in the first place. Collapsing it into one side or the other, either treating it as purely a psychological habit to be retrained or treating it as entirely an environmental problem to be survived, misses the place where the actual weight of it lives. The partial resolution that's honest here is this: the performance is not where the work is. It is a symptom of where the work is. And the fact that the performance compounds the original anxiety rather than dissolving it is information, not a verdict on the person running it, but a signal that the strategy has reached its structural limit and is now producing more of what it was built to prevent. That recognition is a beginning, not a solution, but it changes the direction of attention, and that change is not nothing. There is something almost invisible happening in rooms where imposter syndrome is present. Not in one person, in all of them. The person who seems most certain is performing certainty. The person who spoke without hesitation has been rehearsing that lack of hesitation. The one who appears to have settled into belonging stopped showing the seams of their doubt years ago, and the seams are still there, just no longer visible. None of this is announced. None of it is declared. The room operates on the shared fiction that the doubt is unevenly distributed, that most people here are fine and a few are not, and everyone in the room is helping to maintain that fiction because everyone in it has a stake in not being identified as one of the few.
This is collective silence as a structural condition. The word structural matters here. It is not an accident or an oversight that people in professional and intellectual environments rarely disclose the full weight of their uncertainty. The silence is produced by a set of incentives. Visible doubt reads as a signal of provisional belonging. In environments where provisional belonging can tip into exclusion, concealment becomes rational. And when everyone conceals, the baseline shifts. The apparent norm is certainty. Anyone who does feel uncertain now measures themselves against a norm that was never real, that was itself constructed from other people's concealment,
and the distance between their interior experience and that false baseline becomes the measure of their private deficiency. The most corrosive move in this sequence is the one where the shared condition gets individualized. A person looks around the room, registers that everyone else appears settled and certain, and concludes, this gap between them and me is mine. Not ours, mine. The feeling of being uniquely inadequate is not brought in from outside. It is manufactured on-site by the contrast between a real interior experience and a performed exterior that the person has mistaken for genuine interior states in others. The loneliness of imposter syndrome feeds itself from this misreading. It is not just that you feel like a fraud, it is that you believe you are the only one in the room who is feeling this, which converts a structural feature of the human relationship to uncertainty into evidence of a private malfunction. Consider what happens when this silence briefly breaks. In research contexts, in frank conversations late in a conference, in a graduate seminar where one person decides to say something honest about not understanding, almost invariably the response is not isolation, but recognition. The disclosure produces relief in others, not because the problem is solved, but because the problem is named as shared. For a moment, the false baseline collapses. People stop measuring themselves against a norm that was constructed from concealment and start measuring themselves against something closer to what is actually present in the room. The recalibration is immediate and significant. The fact that this relief is so immediate is worth examining. It suggests that the damage being done by collective silence is not slow or cumulative in the way that gradual harms are. It is active, sustained, and operating at full strength as long as the silence holds. The silence does not merely allow the feeling to persist, it is part of the mechanism that gives the feeling its particular quality of isolation and shame. Take the silence away, even briefly, and the quality of the experience changes substantially. The doubt doesn't disappear. The uncertainty about competence and belonging doesn't resolve. What changes is the meaning the doubt carries. It stops being evidence of a unique defect and starts being legible as part of the common texture of serious engagement with work you care about. The structural principle here is that imposter syndrome depends on imperfect information. It depends on the person suffering from it not knowing what is actually present in others. And it sustains that imperfect information by producing conditions, incentives toward concealment, norms of performed certainty that keep the accurate information hidden. The system is, in this sense, self-perpetuating. The more effectively everyone conceals, the more isolated each individual's experience feels, the stronger the incentive to conceal further. The silence compounds.
Now, stress test that principle. Take an environment where transparency about doubt is structurally encouraged, where acknowledging uncertainty is treated as intellectual honesty rather than vulnerability, where the public exposure of not knowing is read as rigor rather than weakness. Does the principle hold? Does collective disclosure genuinely change the experience of imposter syndrome in those environments? Or does the doubt simply find a new hiding place? The answer is not clean. Even in environments where the formal culture encourages openness about uncertainty, the informal hierarchies continue to operate. There are still people whose disclosed doubt is received generously as evidence of thoughtful engagement, and people whose identical disclosure is received as confirmation of concern about whether they belong. The structural inequalities explored earlier don't dissolve because the explicit norm changes. What shifts is the median experience, the average weight of the syndrome across the population.
The tail ends, where the syndrome is heaviest because the environment signals are most ambiguous, remain largely intact. Collective disclosure helps more for some than for others, and the people it helps least are often the people who need it most. This is where the principle starts to show its limits. If the relief that comes from shared acknowledgement were symmetrical, if it worked equally for everyone in the room, then changing the norms of disclosure would come close to a structural solution. The problem would be almost fully in the information gap, and closing the gap would close the problem. But the relief is not symmetrical. The person who entered an environment designed with someone like them in mind gains more from learning that their certain-seeming colleagues are also uncertain, because their doubt was already somewhat abstracted from their membership status. The person whose doubt is tightly coupled to real signals about whether they are genuinely welcome gains less from the disclosure, because the information they most need is not whether others also feel uncertain. It is whether the environment's actual operation will treat them as permanently belonging. Shared acknowledgement of doubt matters. It changes something real about the experience of carrying imposter syndrome in a room with others. The damage of believing you are uniquely struggling is significant enough that reducing it has genuine value. The daily experience of measuring yourself against a false norm is exhausting in a specific way. The comparison is never to a real person, but to a construction, and the construction is always more calibrated than any actual human being. Dissolving that construction, even partially, is a meaningful shift. But naming it as the solution stops the analysis too early. The information gap is real. The collective silence is a structural amplifier that takes an existing experience and makes it harder to bear. Correcting the silence reduces the amplification. What remains, after the amplification is reduced, is still the underlying question, about belonging, about what legitimacy actually requires, about what it means to engage honestly with work when the ground beneath you has never fully settled. That question doesn't dissolve because the room got more honest about its doubts. It becomes more precisely itself. The question without the distortion layered on top of it, which is both lighter and, in some ways, more demanding to answer.
The degree to which a person's sense of self is fused with a professional or intellectual role determines almost everything about how damaging the imposter experience becomes. This is the claim worth sitting with before moving past it too quickly. When someone says, "I feel like a fraud at work," there are two very different things that statement might mean. One is, "I'm uncertain whether I have the skills this situation requires." The other is, "I'm uncertain whether I am the kind of person who deserves to exist in this space, to take up this position, to call themselves what this role implies." Those two uncertainties feel similar from the inside. They are structurally different in their consequences. Incompetence stops being a professional concern and becomes an existential one. This fusion is not random. It is produced. Institutions that demand total identification with role, graduate programs, certain professions, elite organizations, often function by selecting for exactly this fusion, because people who have staked their identity on the work will work without limit. The cost is externalized. The person carries it privately as the sense that any failure at the work is a failure of the self, and any doubt about the work is evidence that the self was fraudulent from the beginning. Think about what this does to the experience of imposter syndrome specifically. If competence and worth are held separately, doubt about one does not collapse into doubt about the other. The feeling remains uncomfortable, but it stays attached to something that can in principle be addressed. If the two are fused, the feeling has nowhere bounded to land. The question, "Am I good enough at this?" becomes indistinguishable from, "Am I a legitimate person?" Every piece of negative evidence confirms a verdict about the self, not just about the performance. And positive evidence, praise, recognition, demonstrated achievement, cannot provide lasting relief because it gets absorbed into the self it was supposed to reassure and immediately produces the next question. How long until the verdict reverses? This is why external validation fails so reliably for people at the severe end of the syndrome. The mechanism has been described from other angles in earlier territory here, but the identity fusion dimension adds something specific. Validation from outside reaches the person and is processed by a system that has already set the threshold for what counts as sufficient proof beyond any achievable level. Because what is really being asked, without being named as the question, is not, am I competent at this task, but am I the person I have staked my worth on being? No amount of external evidence can answer that question, because that question is not actually about evidence. It is about a relationship to the self that evidence cannot restructure by accumulating. The most dangerous moment is not when the doubt is loudest. It is when the doubt is quiet, but the fusion is total. When someone has so thoroughly merged with the role that the doubt has nowhere to go except inward and permanent. A person can carry imposter syndrome for years in a state of functional performance, with no obvious crisis, while the substrate of their self-assessment is quietly organized around the possibility that the entire structure of who they are is built on fraudulent ground. That is a different kind of suffering than the acute version. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as a certain kind of exhaustion, a reluctance to take risks, a subtle attenuation of the person's range of self-expression, as though they are keeping themselves small enough not to be fully tested, because being fully tested would mean the fraud could be fully confirmed. The unresolved boundary at the center of this is genuinely difficult. Identity investment in work is not wholly a pathology. Caring deeply about what you do, feeling that it matters to who you are, bringing genuine self to the quality of the work, these are not errors to be corrected. The problem is not investment itself. The problem is what happens when investment slides into the kind of fusion where the self has no protected ground outside the role. Some degree of separation between what you do and what you are is necessary for the imposter experience to remain survivable rather than consuming. But where that line is, and how to hold it without withdrawing from the work in a way that evacuates the care that makes the work good, that is not a question with a clean, structural answer. The fusion was not assembled by a single decision, and it does not come apart by one either. What can be named with precision is the mechanism. Identity fusion transforms imposter syndrome from a professional concern into an existential condition, and that transformation is what determines how corrosive the experience becomes over time. The person who can maintain a functional distinction between their worth as a human being and their performance in a role retains a kind of ground to stand on even when the doubt is acute. Not because the doubt is less real, but because the doubt is bounded. It occupies a particular territory without colonizing everything. That bounded doubt is uncomfortable. It can be seriously uncomfortable. What it is not is total. The cost imposter syndrome extracts from creative and intellectual work is specific enough to deserve its own attention. It shows up in two directions, and neither of them leads anywhere honest.
The first is caution taken past the point of useful preparation into something that functions as permanent delay. Work gets withheld because it isn't ready yet, and it is never ready yet, because readiness has been made the condition for exposure, and the standard for readiness keeps shifting. A writer revises past the point where revision improves the work into the zone where revision is a form of hiding. A researcher delays submitting a paper until another round of checking
another pass through the literature, another consultation that might reveal the flaw they are certain is there. The behavior looks like rigor from the outside. From the inside, it is the syndrome operating as a veto on participation. The work exists, it has something to offer. The person carrying the doubt has decided, at a level below explicit decision, that the risk of exposure outweighs the value of the contribution, and so the work stays private, or diminished, or indefinitely deferred. This is a cost that rarely gets named as such. Delayed contribution sounds like conscientiousness. Excessive revision sounds like care. The vocabulary of intellectual virtue covers the movement perfectly, which is part of why the pattern sustains itself so easily. The person does not experience themselves as hiding, they experience themselves as preparing. The syndrome never announces its presence in these cases, it simply sets the threshold for readiness slightly beyond the present state of the work, over and over, indefinitely. Then there is the other direction, when caution becomes unbearable, when the gap between what is felt internally and what is demanded externally grows wide enough that something has to give, the response can flip entirely. The person stops withholding and starts performing certainty at a level that exceeds what they actually possess. Papers are submitted with confident claims that internally feel overstated. Positions are taken in discussions with a firmness that has more to do with managing the appearance of doubt than with genuine conviction about the idea. Leadership decisions get made with declared confidence when the honest register would be something more provisional. The performance of certainty is not dishonesty in the ordinary sense. It is a survival response to an environment that has signaled, in whatever ways environments signal these things, that visible doubt is incompatible with being taken seriously. Neither of these responses, the excessive caution or the overcorrection, is honest engagement with the actual work. And that distinction matters more than it might initially seem. The work that comes out of genuine intellectual engagement has a different texture than the work that comes out of either hiding or performing. Genuine engagement includes the uncertainty. It registers what is not yet resolved, what the evidence doesn't fully support, where the argument has a soft edge. When caution suppresses the work entirely, that honesty never reaches anyone. When overcorrection performs confidence the person doesn't have, the work loses the precision that honest acknowledgement of limits would have given it. In both cases, the syndrome is not just affecting the person, it is affecting the quality of what gets made and offered.
Consider what happens to a field over time when many of its participants are operating in one of these two modes. The literature fills with either absent contributions or overclaimed ones. The conversations in seminars and conferences run hotter with confidence than the underlying evidence warrants, or go quiet in exactly the places where genuine uncertainty would be most productive to name. The intellectual culture of a discipline is partly a function of what people are willing to say out loud about what they don't know, and imposter syndrome systematically distorts that willingness, pulling it in opposite directions, toward silence or toward performed certainty, and away from the middle register, where honest, bounded, provisional claims live. The human cost at the individual level runs alongside this. A person trapped between these two responses develops a particular kind of exhaustion that is different from overwork. It is the exhaustion of managing the distance between what is felt and what is expressed, sustained across every significant interaction in their professional life. The caution requires constant vigilance, always checking whether the work is exposed enough to matter, pulling back whenever the exposure feels like too much. The overcorrection requires maintenance, sustaining a presentation that outpaces the internal experience, monitoring the gap to make sure it doesn't show. Both demand a portion of the energy
that would otherwise go into the work itself. The syndrome is not just emotionally costly. It is cognitively expensive in a way that directly reduces the quality of what is possible. What partial resolution looks like here is not the elimination of doubt, because doubt about the work is frequently appropriate and functional. The question is whether the doubt gets to inform the work or govern it. When it informs, it produces the precision that distinguishes honest intellectual contribution from confident noise. When it governs, it produces either the silence of perpetual preparation or the overclaimed certainty of the performance trap. The difference is in where the doubt sits in relation to the work, as a tool of assessment the person uses or as a verdict about whether the person has the right to participate at all. That distinction is achievable, even if not cleanly or permanently. It requires a kind of ongoing negotiation with the doubt, not an attempt to silence it. Treating the uncertainty about the work as information, asking what it is pointing at, whether the concern is about the work's actual quality or about how the work will be received, separates the two things that imposter syndrome conflates. There is a real question about whether the work is good. There is a separate question about whether the person will be accepted as someone whose work belongs in this conversation. Imposter syndrome answers both questions with the same verdict, in the same direction. Learning to hold them as distinct questions, each with its own kind of evidence and its own kind of reasoning, is the movement available here. Not a resolution of the doubt, but a reorganization of what authority the doubt holds over what decisions.
Shame and curiosity cannot occupy the same space at the same time. You can feel it, constantly in many cases, but you cannot examine it, because examination would require getting close to the thing. And the thing is exactly what you are trying to keep from being fully seen, even by yourself. This is worth sitting with as a structural observation, not a comforting one. When doubt about competence or belonging is held in shame, it does something specific. It makes the doubt untouchable. Shame doesn't hide the wound. It keeps the wound intact by making any contact with it feel like confirmation of the verdict it carries. Curiosity does something structurally different. It moves toward what is uncertain rather than away from it. It asks what is actually there, not to assign blame or reach a verdict, but because the not knowing itself has become more interesting than the defense against it. The paradox is this: both responses are directed at the same material. The doubt about whether you belong, whether your work is real, whether the recognition you've received is built on something solid. That doubt is present in either case. Shame and curiosity are not different experiences of different content. They are different relationships to the same content. And the difference in relationship changes what the doubt can do. When the relationship is shame, the doubt functions as a sentence. It sits in the background of every professional interaction, every moment of visibility, as a verdict that has already been rendered and is simply waiting to be confirmed by the next piece of evidence. The person doesn't examine the doubt, they manage it, work around it, perform past it, or withdraw from the situations most likely to expose it. The doubt becomes the organizing principle of behavior without ever being directly engaged. It governs from a position of quarantine. You never look at it closely enough to ask whether it actually holds up, because looking at it closely would mean acknowledging that it might be right. Shame makes the doubt irrefutable by making it unexaminable. Curiosity, when it becomes possible, changes the terms. The doubt is still there, the feeling that what you've built might be less solid than it appears, that the people around you might be operating from a different quality of knowledge or belonging, that the next significant evaluation might be the one where the whole structure shows its weakness. None of that disappears.
What shifts is whether you can approach those questions as questions rather than as verdicts. What specifically are you uncertain about? Is the uncertainty about the work itself, its quality, its rigor, its honesty? Or is it about how the work will be received, and by whom, and on what terms? Is the sense of not belonging pointing at something real about the environment, or at something about the internal threshold that keeps moving the moment it looks close to being met?
These are not rhetorical questions. They are the kind of questions that shame makes impossible to ask, because asking them requires staying with the material rather than managing its emotional charge. A person under the governance of shame around their own doubt cannot easily ask these questions because the asking itself feels like a concession, an admission that the doubt might be founded, which shame has already converted into an admission that the person is fraudulent. The logic of shame is circular in exactly this way. Any engagement with the doubt confirms the doubt. The only safe move is not to engage. Think about what this means for how the doubt functions in practice. Under shame, every confirmation of competence arrives already tainted. Praise gets filtered through the question of whether it would survive fuller disclosure. Recognition gets held at arm's length because the person receiving it knows something the recognizer presumably doesn't. The external validation touches the surface but cannot reach the structure underneath because the structure is organized around concealment. Curiosity doesn't make the external validation more reliable. It changes what the person does with the doubt that persists despite the validation. Instead of the validation failing to close the gap, and shame registering that failure as further evidence, curiosity allows the person to ask why the gap persists and what it is actually pointing at. This is where the paradox becomes genuinely difficult to resolve. Curiosity about one's own doubt is not a comfortable state. Moving toward the uncertainty means staying with something that is genuinely uncomfortable. The acknowledgement that you don't fully know whether your work is as solid as it appears, that your sense of belonging in this space is not settled, that the internal experience of competence does not come with a guarantee. Curiosity doesn't make these things less true, it makes them available for examination. And examination, unlike management, can sometimes produce actual information about what the doubt is tracking, where it is a precise perception and where it is distortion, what it would take to address the part of it that is addressable. The consequence for you, if you are living inside this, is not comfortable to name. Shame is protective in a narrow sense. It keeps you away from the thing that feels most dangerous. It also keeps you locked in a relationship to your own uncertainty that cannot change, because change requires contact with the material, and shame makes contact feel like collapse. Curiosity costs more in the short term. It means sitting with the doubt without the defensive shell, asking what is actually there rather than performing past it or hiding from it. The reason to do that is not that it will be easier. It is that shame's version of protection preserves the wound without changing it, year after year, while the doubt remains as governing and as untouchable as it was at the start. Curiosity at least moves. It can locate the wound, ask what it is actually responding to, and begin to distinguish between what is real information and what is an old reflex still firing in a situation that no longer matches the conditions that created it.
That distinction between the doubt that is carrying real information and the doubt that is running an outdated program is only available on the other side of that shift in posture. And the shift is not permanent once achieved. It requires returning to. Shame is always available as a response to uncertainty, and familiar enough to feel like the honest one. The work is in choosing repeatedly to stay with curiosity instead. Not because curiosity is comfortable, but because it is the only relationship to the doubt that can actually change what the doubt does. There is an assumption woven into how most people think about belonging, that it is a threshold.
that there is a point you either reach or don't, and that reaching it ends the question. You get the degree, the position, the publication, the recognition, and the feeling of legitimacy follows. The feeling that you have arrived. The assumption is so widely held that it rarely gets examined. It operates in the background as the implicit promise that drives effort forward. Do more, demonstrate more, accumulate more evidence of competence, and eventually the inside will catch up with the outside. The problem with this is structural, and it surfaces quickly once you look at it directly. The threshold is not fixed, it moves. The moment a particular credential or achievement or recognition is within reach, or actually reached, the internal standard for what would constitute genuine arrival adjusts upward. This is not a personal failure of gratitude or satisfaction. It is what happens when belonging has been framed as a destination, because destinations are defined by not being there yet, and that definition persists right up to and past the moment of arrival. The finish line is always just far enough ahead to keep its function intact. What this mechanism produces over years is a kind of permanent deferral. The version of yourself who fully belongs is always future tense. You are in the process of earning something that, once earned, will simply raise its own requirements. A researcher who has spent years feeling like an outsider in their field doesn't, typically, receive tenure and discover that the feeling dissolves. The field expands. The stakes adjust. New cohorts arrive who seem more natural in the space. The internal register shifts to accommodate all of this, and the sense of provisional membership migrates forward intact.
The common understanding of imposter syndrome treats this as a distortion, a failure to register what has actually been achieved. That framing has some truth in it, but it misses something. The problem isn't only that achievement is being underweighted. The problem is that belonging has been assigned to a category it was never going to fit. Destinations can be reached. Practices cannot be completed. They can only be sustained, refined, interrupted, and resumed. When you treat a practice as if it were a destination, you don't just misunderstand the timeline. You install a mechanism that guarantees the feeling of not yet will persist regardless of what actually accumulates. Belonging, when you examine what it actually is in any field or community that matters, is something people do rather than something they have. It is the ongoing engagement with the work, the willingness to bring what you think into the shared space, the capacity to hold the uncertainty of not yet knowing alongside the continued act of contributing anyway. Someone who has belonged to a discipline for decades is not someone who, at some earlier point, crossed a line and stopped questioning their legitimacy. They are someone who has developed a practice of showing up to the uncertainty repeatedly, long enough that the showing up has become the belonging. A person early in a demanding intellectual or professional environment, someone who arrived from a different class background or across a cultural gap or into a space that had historically excluded people like them, often experiences the threshold assumption most acutely. The implicit promise of the environment is, prove yourself sufficiently and you will belong. So the person proves themselves and proves themselves again, and the belonging stays in the future tense. At some point, it becomes possible to ask whether the threshold was ever going to close, or whether it was designed to stay open, whether the structure of the environment itself was built around a permanent audition.
That question is worth staying with rather than immediately answering, because it sits at the intersection of two different things that imposter syndrome tends to conflate. There is the internal mechanism,
the threshold assumption, the permanent deferral, the goal that keeps repositioning itself beyond the present. And there is the external reality of how certain institutions and communities have historically managed access and legitimacy. Both are real. The internal mechanism can be running even in environments that are genuinely open and welcoming. The external reality of uneven access and moving goalposts can be operating even when the internal mechanism has been partly addressed. Conflating them produces either an overcorrection that dismisses all structural inequity as personal distortion, or an undercorrection that refuses to examine the internal mechanism because it feels like capitulating to a system that should be changed. The reframe available here, and calling it a reframe, understates how much of a structural shift it actually is in treating belonging as something you practice rather than something you secure. That is a different orientation entirely. A practice has no arrival point, which removes the permanent deferral mechanism. A practice can be assessed in terms of quality and consistency without requiring a verdict on whether you have finally earned your place. It shifts the question from, "Do I belong here?" which imposes a yes-no threshold on something that doesn't have one, to, "Am I engaging honestly with what this space requires, and am I bringing what I actually have to offer?" The distinction sounds modest. Lived out, it is substantial. It changes what counts as evidence. Under the threshold model, every mistake, every gap in knowledge, every moment of uncertainty is evidence against arrival. Confirmation that the threshold hasn't been met yet. Under the practice model, those same things are part of what practice looks like. Uncertainty is expected. Gaps are what learning is made of. Mistakes are information about where the practice needs attention. None of this is motivational repackaging. It is a different account of what the activity actually consists of. The complication, and there is always one, is that the practice model can be appropriated by environments that use it to avoid accountability. An institution that perpetually asks people to prove themselves, to keep engaging, to trust the process, without ever acknowledging that the process has not been evenly available to everyone who enters it, can hide behind the language of practice and ongoing engagement to avoid confronting what it has actually been doing with access and legitimacy. The reframe from destination to practice is useful and necessary as an internal shift. It does not dissolve the political question of who designed the environment, who the goalposts were built for, and whose sense of provisional membership is being produced by structural conditions rather than internal habit.
What remains after examining all of this is the recognition that the question of belonging cannot be answered once and carried forward. It gets answered provisionally, partially, in each sustained act of engagement with the work and the space. That is not a diminishment of what belonging means. It is a more honest account of what it has always been for anyone who has pursued something genuinely difficult in a space that made real demands on them. The question of who decides what counts as legitimate membership in a field has never been neutral. It has always been answered by whoever held the authority to answer it. And that authority was not distributed evenly, has not been distributed evenly. And the historical record on this is not ambiguous. Credentials were designed in specific institutional contexts, by specific kinds of people, for specific kinds of successors. Access to the training required to obtain those credentials was controlled. The cultural signals that read as competence, the ease, the vocabulary, the manner of occupying intellectual space, were learned behaviors available to those already inside the social conditions that taught them. All of this is documented history, not conjecture. What imposter syndrome sometimes does, and this is the part that standard psychological framing tends to skip, is register this history accurately. When someone enters a professional or intellectual space that was not designed with them in mind and feels a persistent sense of provisional membership, of being watched for the mistake that will confirm the underlying suspicion, of needing to demonstrate what others simply inherit, that feeling is not always distortion. The environment may actually be organized around an implicit standard of belonging that the person has not been granted in advance the way others have. The feeling of being an impostor in those cases is tracking something real about the political architecture of the space. This creates a genuine problem for how the syndrome is typically addressed. If the feeling is classified entirely as a cognitive error, a failure to register one's own competence, then the response is to correct the cognitive error. Remind yourself of your qualifications. Reattribute the feeling to distortion. But if the feeling is sometimes an accurate perception of structural conditions, then that response asks the person to stop seeing something that is actually there. It replaces a real perception with a more comfortable one and calls the replacement psychological health. The concept of gatekeeping names a real mechanism. Access to legitimate membership in a field, who gets published, who gets funded, who gets mentored, who gets described as a natural fit, has historically been controlled in ways that correlated with factors unrelated to the quality of the actual thinking. Gender, race, class background, institutional affiliation, the kind of secondary education available in the place you grew up. These have all functioned as filters. Not universally, not in every case, and with significant variation across disciplines and time periods. The direction of the effect, though, is well established. People whose characteristics matched those of the existing gatekeepers moved through the filters with less friction. People whose characteristics did not match encountered the filters as active resistance. A person who grew up far outside the social world of a profession, who acquired the necessary technical knowledge through routes that the profession doesn't officially recognize as prestigious, who arrived without the network connections that smooth early career navigation, that person has real reasons to sense that the ground is less stable under them than it is under someone whose entire upbringing was oriented toward this destination. The sense of provisional membership is not imagined. The conditions producing it are structural and specific. Where this becomes philosophically difficult is in the relationship between the structural reality and the individual experience of it. Because the same structural conditions can produce two very different internal responses in two different people. One person develops a sharp, almost diagnostic awareness of institutional power and how it operates. Another develops a generalized shame that attaches to the self rather than to the conditions. The structural conditions don't determine which response follows. The mediating variables, relational history, prior experience with institutional belonging, access to frameworks for understanding what is happening, matter enormously. And this means that two people in virtually identical structural positions can have internally very different experiences of what their doubt about belonging is actually tracking. This is why the political dimension and the psychological dimension of imposter syndrome cannot be cleanly separated, but also cannot be collapsed into each other. Someone who has been shaped by conditions of genuine exclusion may still be running an internal mechanism that goes beyond what those conditions rationally warrant, who amplifies the evidence of structural disadvantage into a verdict about fundamental inadequacy rather than a description of environmental conditions. Someone who has benefited from every structural advantage may still carry a version of the feeling that is entirely internally generated, with no correspondence to actual external threat. The structural reality and the internal experience are in relationship, but neither one fully explains the other. The harder question, the one that remains after you acknowledge the structural dimension,
is what a person is supposed to do with it. Because the recognition that some part of the feeling is tracking real political conditions does not, by itself, resolve what to do with the feeling. It clarifies its sort. It makes certain kinds of self-blame less appropriate. It locates some of the problem in the architecture of the environment rather than entirely in the individual's perception. All of that matters. And then the person still has to figure out how to work in the space, how to navigate the conditions that are real, how to bring what they actually have without waiting for the conditions to become fair first. Because waiting for structural fairness to arrive before engaging fully is often another form of the deferral that the syndrome already promotes.
What the political dimension does, at its most useful, is change the terms of the self-assessment. If the sense of provisional membership is partly a response to real structural conditions, then it is not exclusively a statement about the person's qualifications or the quality of their work. It is also a statement about the environment, about who the environment was built for, who it assumes as its default occupant, and what invisible labor is required of those who arrive without the inherited social capital that makes the belonging feel automatic. Confidence under these conditions is a more complicated virtue than it is usually presented as. A person who moves through a gate-kept space with full confidence may be accurately perceiving that the gates open for them. A person who enters the same space with persistent doubt may be accurately perceiving that the gates are calibrated differently in their case. The confident one is not necessarily more realistic. The doubting one is not necessarily more distorted. The relationship between confidence and accuracy depends entirely on what the actual structural conditions are, and that cannot be read off from the emotional register alone. This is where imposter syndrome, examined honestly, becomes something more than a psychological inconvenience. It becomes a question about knowledge, about whether the person's internal experience of the space is a reliable guide to what the space actually is. And that question cannot be answered from the inside alone. It requires looking at the environment with the same seriousness applied to the internal experience. Not to excuse the psychological suffering, but to understand it accurately, which is the only basis for addressing it in a way that is honest about what is actually causing it. The relationship between risk and the feeling of not belonging is inverse, and it runs deeper than it first appears. The syndrome operates as a counselor of caution. Its consistent advice is to wait, to prepare more, to verify, to withhold contribution until the question of legitimacy is settled. And the question of legitimacy, as the syndrome frames it, is never settled. So the advice to wait is structurally equivalent to advice to not act, not fully, not yet. The scale of this is worth holding for a moment before narrowing to what actually happens in practice. Every domain that requires genuine contribution, intellectual work, creative work, the kind of professional engagement that moves something forward rather than merely maintaining it, depends on people bringing what they have before it is fully secured, before the outcome is knowable, before the reception is guaranteed. That is not a romantic description of bravery. It is a mechanical description of how anything original enters a shared space. The work has to arrive before the verdict. Exposure is not a side effect of contribution. Exposure is the structure of contribution. You cannot contribute something that has already been confirmed as legitimate by the field it is entering, because confirmation comes after, not before. The syndrome in this light is counseling you toward exactly the condition that makes genuine contribution impossible. Someone in the middle of a difficult research project, genuinely uncertain whether the direction they have chosen is sound, feeling the persistent sense that people with more natural authority in the field would not be so uncertain. That person is being advised internally
to hold back until the uncertainty resolves, to keep refining, to keep preparing, to postpone the moment of actual exposure. The internal logic is self-protective. The structural consequence is that the work stays in preparation indefinitely, or emerges so hedged and qualified that it carries only a fraction of what it actually had to offer. A musician who spent years feeling that their compositional approach was insufficiently trained compared to conservatory-educated peers, and who withheld finished work for half a decade while continuing to refine it toward the standard of legitimacy they couldn't quite locate. This is not a rare case. It is a pattern. And what is characteristic about it is that the withholding did not produce more security. It produced more material for the internal critic to work with. Every additional year of preparation became additional evidence of the gap between where the person was and where they felt they needed to be before exposure was justified. The gap between what imposter syndrome prescribes and what growth actually requires is not a matter of attitude. It is structural. Growth in any demanding domain happens through cycles of exposure and response. You bring something forward, it meets the environment responds, and you incorporate what you learn from that encounter. The cycle requires the exposure step. It cannot run without it. Imposter syndrome is interrupting exactly that step, on the grounds that the exposure step should be postponed until it is safe, not recognizing that the safety it is waiting for can only be produced by the step it is preventing. What this means systemically is that the syndrome's damage is not limited to the individual carrying it. When people doing original work consistently withhold contribution under the influence of the feeling of illegitimacy, the shared space, the field, the discipline, the creative community, the organization, is depleted of exactly the perspectives it most needed. The people most likely to feel like imposters, as established earlier in this argument, are disproportionately people entering spaces not designed for them. Those are frequently the people whose contributions would most alter the field's range. Their absence from the shared discourse is not neutral. The field becomes a narrower version of itself, organized increasingly around the perspectives of those who never had reason to doubt their right to speak. This is not an abstraction. The accumulation of withheld contributions has a shape. Disciplines that have historically concentrated doubt in specific populations have also historically reflected the perspectives of those who did not carry that doubt, not because those perspectives were superior, but because they were the ones that made it to the shared space. The syndrome functions at scale as a sorting mechanism that removes from view the people it most consistently visits. Understanding this changes what is at stake when you sit with the syndrome rather than acting through it. The cost is not only personal, the deferred ambition, the diminished scope of your own engagement. The cost extends to whatever space you are working in. When the syndrome's logic is followed and contribution is withheld, the field does not notice a specific absence. It simply continues with what arrived. The work that did not come forward is not mourned. It is simply not there. The open question that sits at the edge of all this is what it actually means to act through the syndrome when the counseling to hold back is active and loud. Because understanding the structural inversion, knowing that the syndrome is prescribing the opposite of what growth requires, is not the same as finding it easy to expose work that feels unready, to speak in rooms where the sense of provisional membership is running at full volume, to bring a direction forward before the legitimacy questions have been resolved. The structural clarity is real, and it does not dissolve the experience. It changes what you understand the experience to mean, and what you understand to be at stake in the choice you make inside it. There are two ways imposter syndrome can move when you finally look at it directly.
One is that the scrutiny produces relief. You see the mechanism. You understand where it came from. You recognize the conditions that installed it, and something loosens. The pressure doesn't vanish, but it becomes navigable. The other is that the scrutiny produces another layer of demand. Now you know better. So why are you still feeling it? Which becomes its own version of the original problem. Both of these are real trajectories, and which one opens up depends significantly on what kind of attention you are bringing to the examination. Self-compassion, when it actually functions, is a particular epistemic operation. It is the application of honest, evidentiary standards to your own case. Not generous standards, not lenient ones, honest ones. The same ones you would apply if you were assessing someone else you respected and were trying to understand fairly. When a colleague makes a significant error on a project you both care about, and you are trying to understand what happened, you do not conclude from that single event that they are fundamentally unsuited to the work. You look at the full picture. You factor in the conditions. You hold the error as one data point in a larger account. This is not softness. It is how honest assessment works. The failure to apply this to yourself is not rigor. It is a double standard, one set of epistemic rules for everyone else, a different, harsher set for your own case.
The asymmetry is the actual problem. Imposter syndrome does not suffer from a shortage of self-examination. It suffers from an excess of examination conducted under systematically biased rules. The failures are weighted heavily, held in detail, returned to repeatedly. The evidence of genuine competence passes through a filter that treats it as less reliable. Luck, circumstance, the low bar of the specific context. The result is not an accurate picture. It is a picture organized around a pre-established verdict, with the evidence sorted to support it. That is bad epistemology, not in a moralistic sense, in a plain functional sense. The method is producing inaccurate outputs, and the inaccuracy is structured in one direction. What honest application of standards looks like in practice is something closer to what researchers call null hypothesis thinking, though you do not need the terminology to use the concept. It means you do not get to assume the negative by default and then require strong evidence to dislodge it. You hold the question open. You look at what the evidence actually shows before reaching a conclusion. When someone receives consistent recognition for their work across multiple independent contexts over a significant span of time from people with no coordinated motive to deceive, that constitutes evidence. It is not proof of genius, not a guarantee of future performance, not a resolution of every open question. It is evidence, with real weight, that belongs in the picture alongside the failures and the gaps. The reason this feels harder than it sounds is that the biased process has the texture of honesty. It presents itself as rigorous self-knowledge, the willingness to see what others will not, to refuse the comfortable delusion, to maintain standards even when they are costly. What it is actually doing is something different. It is selecting evidence to support a conclusion that was reached before the evidence was examined. That feels like clarity because it is consistent and certain, and clarity and certainty have similar phenomenology. They feel the same from the inside. The difference is in the process that produced them. A person sitting with years of work in a difficult field, technical fluency accumulated through thousands of hours of practice, a track record of problems solved and decisions made well under pressure, and still experiencing that work as fundamentally suspect, as likely to be revealed as fraudulent when scrutinized closely enough. That person is not practicing rigorous self-knowledge. They are running a process that has already decided the answer and is reading the evidence through that answer.
The self-compassion required is not to dismiss the doubt. It is to subject the doubt itself to the same scrutiny it has been applying to everything else. This is why the instruction to be kinder to yourself, standing alone, reaches nothing. Kindness is not the relevant variable. The relevant variable is methodological honesty. You are allowed to apply to your own case the same careful, contextual, evidence-sensitive thinking you would apply to any question you were trying to answer well. You are not required to be harder on yourself than you would be on anyone else to maintain your integrity. The extra hardness is not integrity. It is a distortion operating under integrity's name.
There is a specific version of this that appears in creative and intellectual work, where the output is not easily quantifiable and the standards of success are genuinely contested. A writer, a researcher, a designer, a teacher, anyone whose work requires judgment rather than measurement faces an additional layer. The absence of a clear external metric makes the internal critic's verdicts harder to challenge with evidence because the relevant evidence is always interpretable. A strong piece of work can be read as strong, or as strong for now, or as strong within a limited range. The internal critic will reliably take the more diminishing reading. Honest epistemic practice requires noticing this tendency and adjusting for it, not by overcorrecting toward inflation, but by not systematically accepting the diminishing reading as default.
The partial resolution that becomes available through this kind of practice is not the elimination of doubt. It is the restoration of something like a fair trial. The doubt gets to make its case. The evidence in the other direction also gets to make its case. The verdict is held provisionally, as all honest verdicts on complex questions are. This does not produce the feeling of confidence that imposter syndrome is supposedly the absence of. What it produces is something more workable, a relationship to your own competence that is neither falsely inflated nor systematically suppressed, and from which it becomes possible to act without waiting for a certainty that the nature of genuine work makes structurally unavailable. The person who withholds work until it meets an internal standard of legitimacy that keeps shifting, who prepares more, refines more, waits for the feeling of readiness that does not arrive, is not practicing quality control. They are practicing the application of an unfair standard to their own output, one that holds their work to conditions of certainty no work in a demanding domain can satisfy before it enters the world. The same person, applying honest epistemic standards, would recognize that the threshold keeps moving, that the movement is a feature of the assessment process rather than a feature of the work's actual state, and that the most honest response is to expose the work to the scrutiny it would need to actually be tested. What makes this a partial resolution, and it is only partial, is that none of this guarantees the work is as good as the process concludes it might be. Honest assessment can still reach a wrong conclusion. The evidence can be real and still insufficient. Self-compassion practiced as epistemic fairness does not produce accuracy as a guaranteed output. It produces a less systematically biased process, which is different from a perfect one. The doubt that remains after honest assessment is not necessarily residual distortion. It may be the accurate perception of genuine uncertainty, which is the condition every serious practitioner works inside, not evidence that this particular practitioner does not belong. There is a small thing that happens when the internal critic arrives with particular force. You can notice it, or you can simply follow wherever it leads. Most of the time, people follow. The voice arrives, makes its case, and the case is accepted without examination. Not because the person is passive or credulous, but because the critic has the texture of obvious truth. It sounds like the voice of clear-eyed assessment. The path of least resistance
is to treat it as such. But here is what becomes visible when you stop and look at the critic as a system rather than as a verdict. It does not arrive with equal intensity across all situations. It concentrates. There are specific conditions, specific relationships, specific kinds of evaluation, specific institutional settings, under which it becomes louder, more certain, more insistent. And there are other conditions under which it is quiet, or present but manageable, or nearly absent. The variation is information. A verdict that arrives with different volume, depending on where you are standing, is not a neutral account of what you are. It is a system responding to triggers, and triggers can be mapped.
The structural principle here is that the internal critic of imposter syndrome is not a continuous state. It is a conditioned response, meaning it has specific antecedents, specific contexts that activate it, and specific conditions under which it loses its grip. This sounds simple, and it is, in the way that most observations about pattern are simple once you can see the pattern. The difficulty is that from inside the experience, the critic presents itself as timeless and context-independent. It does not announce that it arrived because you walked into a room where someone you perceive as more credentialed is present, or because you are about to be evaluated by someone whose approval carries particular weight for structural reasons that have nothing to do with your actual performance. It arrives and presents itself as the truth about you, full stop. Mapping what actually precedes the intensification is a different activity from trying to silence the critic or argue it out of its position. When you try to argue the critic down, marshalling counter-evidence, rehearsing achievements, telling yourself the feeling is irrational, you are still accepting the critic's terms. You are treating it as a conversational partner whose verdict needs to be overturned. The map-making approach is different. It treats the critic as a phenomenon to be understood, which means the relevant question shifts from, is the critic right or wrong, to, what conditions produced this level of activation right now? Someone presenting work at a conference for the first time notices that the sense of illegitimacy is overwhelming in that context and genuinely subdued when working alone at the bench. The difference in activation is not explained by any difference in competence. The competence is the same in both rooms. What changes is the evaluative structure of the situation, the presence of external judgment, the perceived hierarchy, the visibility. Understanding this means the person can work with specific conditions, rather than managing a global state of self-doubt. That is navigability. It is not the elimination of the critic. It is the conversion of the critic from a sovereign into a symptom with a readable pattern. Stress testing this principle honestly requires asking whether it holds when the conditions are extreme, when the institutional setting is not merely unfamiliar, but actively structured to produce doubt in people like the person inside it. When the hierarchy is not a projection, but a real arrangement of power that consistently devalues certain kinds of contribution. When the evaluative standards are genuinely contested, and the critic's intensification is, at least in part, a response to something real rather than imagined. The mapping principle does not dissolve under these conditions. If anything, it becomes more important there, because it offers a way to distinguish between what is being generated by the person's internal system and what is a response to an external structure that would generate something similar in almost anyone occupying that position.
The principle breaks at a particular edge, though. Mapping the conditions of the critic's activation does not by itself tell you what to do with what you have mapped. You can have excellent knowledge of your own pattern. You can know precisely that evaluation by a specific kind of authority figure in a public setting on work that touches on the core of your professional identity will produce maximum activation. And that knowledge will not guarantee the ability to act differently inside the experience. Understanding a system and having functional leverage over it are two distinct things. The map is not the same as the route. This is the transition point where the principle reaches its own limit. The act of mapping creates the possibility of navigation, but the navigation is still a thing that has to happen in real time, under real conditions, with the critic running at whatever volume it reaches. What the map does is change the quality of attention available inside the experience. When the critic arrives, and you recognize it as a conditioned response with identifiable triggers, it does not vanish. But it also does not arrive as a complete surprise, as a sudden revelation of what you are, as the final word on a question that had been open. It arrives as something you have seen before, in conditions you recognize, following a pattern you have learned. That is a different relationship to the same experience. And a different relationship to the experience is what changes what the experience can ask of you, whether it can continue to function as a verdict you obey, or whether it becomes something you move through while doing the work anyway. There is a version of the internal critic that has done genuine work. This is worth sitting with because the usual framing treats imposter syndrome as pure liability, something that costs you and produces nothing worth keeping. The more honest account is more complicated. The vigilance that makes you prepare thoroughly, the sensitivity to the gaps in your own knowledge, the refusal to overstate what you actually know, the drive to go back and check again before the thing goes out. These are not failures of confidence. They are the habits of someone who takes the work seriously. And in many cases, those habits grew directly from the same soil as the doubt. The tension here is that the critic that drove real rigor and the critic that has since become a judge pronouncing on your fundamental worth are not two different voices. They are the same mechanism at different stages of activation. Early on, in conditions where the gap between what was known and what was required was real and significant, the heightened scrutiny was calibrated. It matched the actual demand. It produced outcomes, preparation, attention, quality of work that were proportional to the pressure being applied. This is how the system earns its authority. It shows results, and the results confirm that the voice was right to push, right to question, right to refuse easy satisfaction. A researcher in the early stages of a demanding field will often describe this relationship with some clarity only in retrospect. The sense that the doubt was useful, that without it, the work would have been shallower, that the insistence on not claiming more than the evidence supports was exactly the discipline the domain required. The productive phase is real. Dismissing it is not honesty. It is a different kind of error.
What happens next is the mechanism that matters. The conditions change, but the system does not automatically recalibrate. The person builds genuine competence over time, not imagined competence, not the performance of competence, but the actual accumulated thing, the fluency that comes from sustained engagement with hard problems. The gap that once existed between what they knew and what the domain required closes or narrows significantly. The heightened scrutiny that was calibrated for a larger gap continues to run on the smaller one, at the same intensity it was trained to maintain. And because the feeling of doubt has been present throughout the period of actual growth, it does not register the growth as a reason to change. It keeps producing verdicts on a situation that has materially changed. This is the point
where the driving force becomes the judge that never acquits. The distinction matters. A driving force is calibrated to a real condition. It produces effort proportional to an actual gap, and it releases when the gap closes. A judge that never acquits has decoupled from the evidentiary situation. The verdict remains the same, regardless of what the evidence shows, which means the process is no longer responsive to reality in the way that genuine rigor is. You can produce work that meets every standard you set, and the judge will find a new standard. You can close the gap that produced the original doubt, and the judge will locate another gap. The mechanism has separated from the function it originally served. The human cost of staying inside that courtroom, past the point where it serves any real purpose, is not dramatic in the way that acute crises are dramatic. It is a slow narrowing. The scope of what feels safe to attempt contracts. The preparation that was once productive extends into preparation that is primarily delay. More research, more refinement, more waiting for the version of readiness that keeps moving. The contribution that could be made now waits for conditions that the judge will not allow to arrive. Not because the work is not ready, but because readiness has been redefined as a threshold that the judge's rules make structurally unreachable. There is also a relational cost. Staying in the courtroom past its useful period produces a particular kind of attention to the work, one that is organized around the question of whether you belong there, rather than the question of what the work needs. These are different orientations. The first is a question about you. The second is a question about the thing being made or understood. When the first question dominates, it pulls attention towards self-monitoring and away from the problem itself. The work suffers, not because of lack of ability, but because the available attention is partially consumed by a trial that keeps reopening. The partial resolution available here is not the silencing of the critic. The productive habits the critic built are worth keeping. The rigor, the care, the refusal to overstate, these do not require the shame component to function. They can be retained without the trial. What can be let go is the procedure by which the critic converts a history of useful pressure into a permanent determination of worth. The task is something more like selective extraction, holding on to what the vigilance built while recognizing that the courtroom in which it now operates has continued to run past the point where its proceedings bear any necessary relationship to what is actually happening in the work.
This requires a specific kind of attention to what the critic is doing in any given moment. When it arrives, the question is not whether it is entirely wrong. Some portion of it may be responding to something real, a genuine gap, an honest uncertainty, a place where more care actually is warranted. That portion is worth hearing. What does not warrant the same deference is the part that has moved past the specific gap and into the territory of general verdict, the part that treats every instance of doubt as evidence for the same conclusion about fundamental legitimacy. Those two activities can be distinguished. It takes practice to separate them, and the separation is not always clean. But the ability to ask in a given moment whether the critic is pointing at something specific and actionable, or whether it has moved into the jurisdiction it no longer has cause to occupy, that ability is where the extractable usefulness lives. Uncertainty is the ground condition of genuine work. This is not a consolation, it is a structural description. When you are doing something that has not been done exactly this way before, or understanding something at a level of depth that reveals how much remains unresolved, you are, by definition, operating without a complete map. The absence of the map is not a sign that you are lost, it is a sign that you are somewhere real maps haven't reached yet.
The usual relationship to not knowing is to treat it as a temporary state, a deficiency that will be corrected as you learn more, become more skilled, accumulate more evidence of your own competence. This is the tacit promise that sustains the deferral mechanism. Once you know enough, the doubt will lift. Once you have enough credentials, enough publications, enough successful projects behind you, the feeling of inadequacy will convert into a stable sense of legitimacy and remain there. The problem is that this conversion does not occur in the way the promise implies. The people who have worked longest in demanding fields do not, as a rule, describe arriving at a place of settled certainty about their own adequacy. They describe learning to work inside the uncertainty, rather than waiting for it to resolve before they proceed. What changes, in the cases where something genuinely changes, is the meaning assigned to not knowing. Imposter syndrome assigns it one meaning: insufficiency, fraudulence, evidence of fundamental unsuitability. That meaning makes uncertainty into a verdict. The alternative is not to pretend certainty exists when it doesn't. The alternative is to recognize that not knowing is the texture of the work itself, the condition under which anything genuinely new gets done, and that the feeling of operating without a confirmed template is not evidence of inadequacy, but evidence of engagement with something real.
This is a shift in the relationship to uncertainty, not a change in the amount of it.
The uncertainty remains. The open questions do not close. The distance between what is known and what could be known stays legible, and in some respects grows more visible with time. What shifts is the question you bring to that distance. When the distance reads as a measure of your deficiency, it produces the familiar contraction, the withdrawal, the delay, the narrowing of ambition. When it reads as the actual nature of the terrain you are working in, something different becomes possible. The same not knowing that once functioned as evidence against you becomes a description of where you are and what the work requires. There is a particular quality to the experience of someone who has made this shift. It is not confidence in the ordinary sense, the settled assurance that the outcome will be good, that the work is already validated, that the doubts were mistaken all along. It is something more like a willingness to keep going under conditions that cannot guarantee the outcome. A tolerance for the open question that does not require it to close before the next move is made. The uncertainty is still present. The difference is that it is no longer functioning as a gatekeeper that must be satisfied before the work is allowed to continue. The claim that uncertainty is the condition of genuine work also carries a specific implication for how you evaluate the feeling of imposter syndrome when it arrives. If the feeling intensifies precisely when the work is at its most original, most exposed, most genuinely uncertain, which it often does, then the intensification is tracking something accurate. The work is uncertain. The stakes are real. The territory is unmapped. The feeling of not knowing whether this is right, whether this is good enough, whether you are the right person to be doing it, that feeling is not a distortion of the situation. It is a response to the actual conditions. This is where the definitional shift matters most. Imposter syndrome, as it is typically framed, is a distortion, a misreading of your own competence, a failure to correctly assess your qualifications, a gap between reality and perception that therapy or self-talk or accumulated evidence can close. But if the feeling is partly tracking something real, the genuine uncertainty of original work, the genuine openness of hard questions, the genuine distance between where you are and where you might eventually be, then the goal of closing the gap between feeling and reality points in the wrong direction. The feeling is not disconnected from reality. Reality is uncertain. The feeling knows this.
The key insight is that the problem in imposter syndrome
is not the presence of doubt about adequacy in conditions of genuine uncertainty. The problem is the interpretation that converts that doubt into a permanent verdict on personal worth. Two people can stand in the same amount of not knowing. One experiences it as the expected texture of difficult work and continues. The other experiences it as disqualifying evidence and withdraws. The uncertainty is the same. The interpretation is different, and the interpretation determines what the uncertainty is allowed to do to the work. The consequence of this is that overcoming imposter syndrome, if that phrase means anything real, does not look like achieving certainty. It looks like developing a functional relationship with the state of not yet knowing, a relationship in which uncertainty is legible as information about the work, rather than information about the self, in which the open question is something to engage rather than something to hide, in which the feeling of operating without a confirmed template is the expected experience of someone doing genuine work, rather than proof that you are the wrong person to be doing it. This development is not linear, and it is not final. The relationship to uncertainty can hold under familiar conditions and collapse under new pressure. Entering a genuinely new domain, submitting to a genuinely high-stakes evaluation, working in a context where the structural distribution of doubt is weighted against you. These can reactivate the old interpretation even when the new one has been functionally stable for years. The capacity is real, and so is its fragility. Building the new relationship is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing practice in the same way that any skill remains a practice rather than a permanent acquisition. The unresolved boundary here is the one that the episode has been approaching from several directions. If uncertainty is genuinely the condition of serious work, and if the feeling that attaches to that uncertainty is partly accurate rather than entirely distorted, then the question of when to trust the doubt and when to recognize it as a misfired alarm does not have a clean answer. The same feeling can be pointing at something real, a gap that warrants attention, a limit that deserves honest acknowledgement, or it can be running the old pattern, converting ordinary uncertainty into a verdict that was never warranted. Learning to ask which one is happening in any given moment is the actual practice, not the elimination of the doubt, and not its uncritical acceptance. The ongoing, imperfect work of telling the difference between the voice that tracks the terrain and the voice that prosecutes the person standing in it. The question that opened this whole inquiry was whether the feeling ever disappears. It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one, and it deserves a genuine answer. The answer is that for most people doing serious work, in any domain that involves real uncertainty and real stakes, the feeling does not fully disappear. And the more honest response to that fact is not disappointment, but reorientation, because the goal of making it disappear was always aimed at the wrong target. What has been visible across every angle of this inquiry is that the feeling called impostor syndrome is not a single thing. It is several things occurring simultaneously, and they require different responses. There is the part that tracks genuine uncertainty, the accurate perception that the work is hard, the questions are open, and no confirmed template exists for what you are trying to do. There is the part that registers real structural conditions, the environments not designed for you, the uneven distribution of credentials and access, the gatekeeping that is not imaginary. And there is the part that is separated from both of these real things and become a mechanism that converts any uncertainty into a verdict on personal worth, regardless of what the evidence actually shows. These three are entangled. They feel like one thing from the inside.
The work of living well with this, which is the only honest phrase for it, involves learning, gradually and imperfectly, to tell them apart. The political thread matters here at the close, because it is the one most easily set aside in favor of the psychological. When the feeling clusters around people entering spaces that were not built with them in mind, that clustering is not incidental. It is information. The question of who decides what legitimate membership looks like, who holds the criteria, whose way of knowing counts as knowing. These are not questions about individual psychology. They shape the conditions under which individual psychology develops. Treating imposter syndrome purely as a personal problem to be solved by personal effort leaves this structural layer untouched. The feeling can be navigated with more skill. The internal critic can be examined rather than obeyed. The relationship to uncertainty can shift, and the structural conditions that generated the original weight of the feeling can remain exactly as they were. Both levels are real. Neither cancels the other. The relational thread runs through all of it, because the voice that runs the internal prosecution did not arrive without history. It was assembled from specific messages, specific relationships, specific institutional encounters that communicated, sometimes directly, sometimes through silence, something about who belonged and on what terms. The authority that voice now holds is borrowed authority. It was learned, which means it is not fixed. The practices that slowly alter it are not practices of self-congratulation or achievement listing. They are practices of attention, noticing the specific conditions under which the critic intensifies, identifying what it is actually responding to, distinguishing between the signal that points at something real and the pattern that has been running long past the situation that trained it.
The epistemic thread is the one that perhaps runs deepest. The person who has made some genuine progress with this is not the person who has learned to feel certain. There is no evidence that genuine, sustained certainty is the typical end state of serious intellectual or creative work. The person who has made genuine progress is the one who has developed a different tolerance for the open question, who can sit in the state of not yet knowing, without immediately converting it into a judgment about whether they should be the one sitting there. That tolerance is built through continued engagement, through the accumulation of evidence that the work survived the uncertainty, through discovering repeatedly that the absence of a confirmed template is not the same as the absence of capacity. It is not built through reassurance, and it is not built through avoidance of the situations that activate the doubt. There is something worth naming plainly at this point. The people who tend to feel the weight of this most acutely are often the people most likely to be doing work that is genuinely new, genuinely difficult, genuinely exposed to real risk of being wrong. The feeling intensifies where the work is most original, because original work has no prior instance to confirm it is being done correctly. This is a hard truth to sit with, because it means the feeling does not reliably distinguish between people who should withdraw and people who should continue. It is not that kind of signal. It cannot tell you whether the work is worth doing. It can only tell you that the work is uncertain, which is, more often than not, precisely the work worth doing. The question of choice belongs with you, where it always did. Whether the doubt is heard as a verdict or as a description of the terrain, whether the internal critic is obeyed as a judge or examined as a system, whether the uncertainty of the work is read as evidence of unsuitability or as the ordinary condition of anyone doing something real, none of these are questions that resolve themselves. They are answered, or not answered, in the small, ongoing choices about what to attempt, what to submit, what to say out loud, whether to walk into the room again. The macro loop does not close because the feeling stops arriving.
It closes because the feeling arriving no longer has the power to determine the answer. Good night.